You're listening to The Justin Herman Show, where every episode he has conversations with interesting people. Here is your host, Justin Herman.
Well, hey everybody, welcome to The Justin Herman Show. And yes, this episode's going to be fun. We're sticking with some just really smart people, and who better than Michael Knowles, host of the Michael Knowles Show, host of Verdict with Ted Cruz, host of Book Club with Prager University. He is just a really smart guy, young guy, passionate guy, conservative thinker, leader. I really believe that you're going to love the conversation that we are going to have. Now, preface it, I recorded this a while ago with him. I recorded it with him for another podcast that I do called Controlled Chaos. It was the same deal with Andrew Klavan, but we get into such good stuff, culture stuff, leadership, faith stuff, that it totally works on the Justin Herman Show. The conversation's incredible. I think you're going to love it. So I don't want to spend any more time. I love talking to really smart people. Michael Knowles, Daily Wire. You got to check out the Michael Knowles Show. We'll put links in the show notes. Let's not waste any more time. Let's jump in with Michael Knowles. Well, for those who don't know you, can you just give a quick overview of who you are, what you do, and how long you've been doing it?
Absolutely. So I host the Michael Knowles Show, very creatively titled, at the Daily Wire, and I'm also a columnist. I write a column for, obviously, the Daily Wire and for Fox News, and I go on a lot of TV shows as well. And I got into political commentary because I was doing two things for all of my professional life. I was working in politics, I was running campaigns, I had my own little political consulting shop, and I was an actor. So I'm a trained actor. I've done film and television and plays and things like that. And show business and politics were what I did for my whole life. They say that politics is show business for ugly people, which I think is probably true. And so now what I do, I guess, is the combination of both of those. And I'm doing that here in Los Angeles. I was born and raised in New York and came out to LA about 5 years ago. And they say it's the quintessential classic Hollywood story. You move out to LA and you start working in right-wing politics. It's a classic. That's all you ever hear about Hollywood. So that's a brief overview of what I've been doing.
And you got your start. You're younger than me. I'm 34. You're 29?
Yeah.
So you got your start at a young age, obviously learned a bunch. We're going to get into a little bit of that because I think the leadership development journey is probably a really interesting one. But I want to start here, Junior High Ministry Podcast. What were you like in junior high? Describe the Michael Knowles of junior high.
I pride myself on not changing very much over the course of my life. I've had the same haircut since I was about 6 years old. But like everybody else in junior high, I was awkward. I was figuring out what I think about things. And of course, my views on different subjects have changed a lot over time. So especially when I was in junior high, around that time was becoming an atheist. So, which is funny because now I'm a practicing Catholic and I talk about it a lot on the show. But around that time, I was falling away from the church. And by the time I was confirmed in the Catholic Church, I was 13 years old, and I chose the name Thomas as my confirmation saint because Thomas was the doubter, and when I was 13, I thought this was clever. So I was grappling with all of these sorts of questions, not really political questions even or cultural questions, but spiritual and religious and metaphysical questions. And I don't think this is uncommon at all. I think in junior high, that's when you're coming into emerging adulthood. You're ceasing to be a child. You're on the path to becoming an adult. And I think part of the reason that I fell away from the church and why I had why I had that journey is in part because young teenagers are arrogant, we're hubristic, we think we know it all, that goes with the territory. And then I think the other part of it is we do live in a culture that is very confused. It doesn't really know what it is. It doesn't know what made it what it is. And I think that very confusing culture, which has become even more confusing now, 10 or 15 years later, is making that time period even more difficult for young teenagers.
Did you have one or two or three people during those young years that really poured into you, helped you become the kind of the man you are today? Would you look back and say, man, Mr. or Mrs. or these couple of people had this tremendous impact on my life?
Absolutely. I don't know where to begin, though. I mean, obviously, my mother, my father, when I was in elementary school, I mean, I still speak to some of my elementary school teachers. I was fortunate in that I was basically always top of my class, and so the teachers would invest a lot in me. I was always class president, student body president. I was always doing those sorts of things, lead of the play, and so the teachers would invest a lot in me, and I had really great personal relationships with those teachers that endure to this day, from elementary school, middle school, and high school. And I don't even know where to begin. I mean, I could probably rattle off a dozen or more names of some of those teachers who really meant a lot, who helped to structure my life and push me in the right direction and encourage me, and many of whom I still speak to.
That's so great. I have friends just like that, teachers like that, which is surprising when you're living it. When I was young, I didn't understand really the significance of that until I got older. You know, when I'm young, I'm just living it. When I got older, you look back and you see these big moments that happened. You know, you're really thankful for it. I want to talk about your leadership journey. Obviously, at a young age, you started doing a lot of leadership stuff. You got involved in campaigns, like you said. When did you identify yourself, others identify you as a leader, someone who was capable of doing stuff?
As early as I can remember. And so I don't know if that's because of some intrinsic quality that I had or innate quality that I had, or because of the caliber of people who were around me, my parents and teachers, who knew how to pull that out of somebody. So I don't know which it was that came first, but I was always interested in those sorts of things. In my first grade classroom, I was campaigning around for Bob Dole, who ran for president in 1996. And I think I was the only person in the country excited about Bob Dole, probably including Bob Dole. But I went around, I thought Bill Clinton was a draft dodger, Bob Dole was a war hero, and I was trying to get all my classmates to get their parents to vote for Dole. I was so difficult about this that my mother, who was kind of a political moderate, she voted for some Republicans, some Democrats, she wanted to vote for Bill Clinton, and I kept going and telling her all the reasons she had to vote for Dole, so she let me come into the ballot box with her and actually pull it for Bob Dole, which means I committed voter fraud by the age of 6, but I was very happy to be able to do that.
Someone will find you, I'm sure. Someone will find you for sure and make you pay the price for that.
That's right. The Oppo researchers are watching this right now. And so did that, and I started doing plays when I was about 8 years old, and my first time I auditioned for a play, I got the lead. And so I thought, that's pretty good. And so I kept doing that. And then in middle school rather, was the first time I could run for student government, which I did, and I won. And so I kept doing that. And then high school, freshman year, I ran for class president, and I won. And I did that every year. Then I ran for student body president. I won that senior year. And so as with anything, it's not just that when you pursue some activity, you do it as a whim or it's a one-off. You do it as a habit. And so the more it becomes a habit, the better you get at it and the more you do it. And so in college, I was interested not only in student government, but also in professional campaigns. And so after my freshman or sophomore year of college, I helped to run a congressional campaign in New York. It became sort of prominent. We ended up winning. Then I ended up running the Young Voters operations for a couple of presidential candidates the next year. Then we started a political consulting shop. Then I was in political commentary. Then I ended up at the Daily Wire. One thing just leads on to another. What I often would encourage young people to realize is that you don't plan everything out perfectly and you say, okay, I'm going to formulate this perfect plan and then I'm going to execute on it. You just do a lot of things, and the more you do, the more you do. The more you work, the more you work. And God cannot drive a parked car. So you have to cooperate as well. You can't just sit around and say, God, do everything for me and make everything happen that I want to happen. You also have to cooperate in that plan.
You know, looking back at that, are there moments that you would say, man, that door was really open for me, versus, man, I really needed to push the door a little harder. I needed to be a little more persistent to get that going. I know a lot of people listening that, we have, they're sometimes kind of waiting for opportunity to happen, and they're kind of doing what you just talked about, kind of waiting around. Oh, eventually it'll happen. They want God to, drive a parked car. And then there's times that maybe they're too passionate. They're trying to force the door. Where do you see the dichotomy of waiting for the open door and taking the bull by the horns and driving it?
You should always take the bull by the horns, but you can't make an idol out of your own desires. You have to live in reality, and you have to be open to other suggestions and open to other opportunities. So one time, my father's wife said to me, she said, "Michael, you're so successful at everything you do." I forget why she said that, so I'd done something. And I said, "Well, you might be right that I've had successes, but what you're forgetting is I've also failed more than anybody you know as well." And it's just a fact of when you throw spaghetti at the wall, most of it is going to flop down, but maybe one piece of spaghetti sticks, and then you pursue that a little bit. So, for at least 3 or 4 years, I was a professional actor. So I was doing plays in New York, films and TV, things like that. I always had political opportunities at this time, but Hollywood is a one-party town, and it's not the party that I'm a member of. And so I found myself in these situations. I'd be doing a play with very prominent actors, and they'd all be talking politics. They'd all be inviting me to the Bernie Sanders fundraiser. This was happening even in 2016. And I didn't want to go. I didn't want to be a liar. I didn't want to pretend to be somebody that I wasn't. When you get to that crossroads, you have to make a decision. You can't have everything. You don't get to just totally write reality. And so I made the decision to say what I think and to be honest about who I am. Maybe that closed off some doors. Maybe it means I didn't get a movie that I wanted to do, or I didn't get to do a play that I wanted to do. And at the time, when you don't get to do that, you feel really upset. You think, gosh, my career is over. There's nothing I can do. Life is so unfair. But now, as you say, looking back in hindsight, if I had gotten that movie, if I had gotten that TV show, my life would be radically different and almost certainly much, much worse. So I think as long as you're working, as long as you're putting in effort, as long as you're cooperating, and you're not falling into that trap of making an idol out of only what you want, keeping your ears closed to other plans that are in store for you, I think very often you'll do just fine.
And you have a strong faith. You talk about it a ton on the show. Could you just give us an overview of where you started your faith journey and kind of where you are now?
Absolutely. So I was a cradle Catholic. I was baptized as a baby. And growing up, I was quite into religion. I was the sort of head boy of the CCD class, and I really was into it. About 2012, 2002, 2003, there were two things that occurred. One was a publishing craze called the New Atheists. So you had all these people like Christopher Hitchens, Samuel Harris, Daniel Dennett, and that other guy, forget his name, the biologist. They were all saying that God does not exist, it's a stupid fairy tale, it's ridiculous, and faith is childish. And looking back now, reading these books, they're not convincing at all. But to a 13-year-old, that's about the audience for the New Atheists. So I was convinced by that. And at the time, the Catholic Church was going through a lot of sex scandals, still is, and now again is going through sex scandals. But then that time was the really big one. There was also an aspect of the faith, which is that the way it was being borne out and practiced was very much in the spirit of Vatican II. And by that, I mean the faith was, the liturgies were no longer grand. They were no longer very reverent. They were no longer full of smells and bells and tradition, as we talk about. It was a lot of sort of pop songs and shallow theology and shallow exegesis, and it seemed childish. And so for someone who is making the transition from being a child to being a man, I think I wanted to pull away from that. I was not convinced of the aesthetic and historical and intellectual depth of the faith. And so I was an atheist for about 10 years. And I came back because when I was in college, everyone was an atheist and they were all very smart. But I found out the smartest people were Christians. And the ones who had thought about it the most were Catholics and Eastern Orthodox. And a roommate of mine was a cradle Catholic. He was attending a more evangelical church at the time. And he introduced me to a philosopher named Alvin Plantinga, a Calvinist philosopher at Notre Dame, a Calvinist philosopher at a Catholic school. And he came up with something called the modal ontological argument for God, which, without getting in the weeds of it, it's actually a very simple argument for God. The argument is, it's not impossible that God exists, therefore God exists. and there are only a few more steps in the middle. And I tried to find the flaw in this argument, but nobody could really point out a good flaw. Even the great atheist logician Bertrand Russell, he said, I can't figure out the error in this argument. And I thought, gosh, there are some pretty good arguments for God. Then I discovered Thomas Aquinas. I was reading a Protestant evangelist handed me Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. That was hugely transformative. I then read Chesterton. I then became convinced that God exists. I then became convinced that the Gospels are true. I became convinced that Jesus is who he says he is. And really only at that point did I start going back to church. And I was very fortunate that there had been some reforms in the meantime, since I left until that point, largely brought about by Pope Benedict XVI. And some of that tradition, some of that beauty was brought back into the liturgy. And I thought, oh my goodness, this is an adult faith. And so I suppose I left behind a sort of childish understanding of what the faith is and came into more of a full, more of a mature, still childlike but not childish faith. And so I'm fortunate that I basically have the zeal of a convert, even though I was baptized when I was a baby.
Now, you spend time around a lot of college kids, high school kids. You do a lot of speaking with, and the name escapes me.
Young America's Foundation.
Young America's Foundation. And so you get to talk to a lot of young people. What do you, just out of the conversations you've had, where do you see faith in the lives of young people today? What assessments would you make?
Depends on the school, of course. I'll go to some schools that are highly faithful, and then I'll go to some that have never been introduced to Christianity, they just don't know. I mean, so many people in our generation, the millennial generation and Gen Z, are raised without a religion or raised with only sort of vague religion. So it's not that they were raised in something that they rejected. It's that they just don't know to begin with. They're not even atheists. They're called the religiously unaffiliated, or the nuns. And so in many ways, this is a crisis of education. You know, politics, we all talk about politics and jabber about it all the time. But politics is a consequence of culture. And culture is a consequence of religion. Cult and culture come from the same word. They derive from the same term. So I think because our education system has become so hollowed out, we no longer study Latin. We no longer study the classics. We don't study the liberal arts in any coherent way. We just pick sort of random smatterings of subjects and increasingly random sort of ideologies that we're indoctrinated into, that we don't understand our culture. And certainly we're not exposed to the foundation of our culture, which is our religion. So what I see on campuses, I don't really ascribe to the worst stereotypes of millennials and Gen Z and younger Americans. They're entitled, they're spoiled, they're bratty. I don't really ascribe to that at the base. I think they're uneducated and they're uncultured. And that's not entirely their fault. They've been robbed of an education. They've been robbed of their culture. They've been robbed by their parents, by their government, by society. And so part of what I like to do, at least in my speeches, is raise some questions that perhaps they haven't thought of, or maybe frame a question in a way that maybe they haven't thought of, to allow them to try to recover some of what has been lost.
You know, this generation to me is one that is just over the Noah stories. They're over, all the fluffy, and all those things are true. But they want to talk about their friend at school who's gay and why that's, why the church says it's not okay. And they have a transgender friend that they think's pretty great and they want to be really supportive. And then the church says, X, Y, Z. Now, I'm a pastor, so I see the theological and the relational and the biblical behind it. But for a 10, 11, 12, 13-year-old, they're just like, you guys don't get it. How do you bridge that gap?
I just gave a talk at a pro-life camp about 3 days ago at a church, and half of the questions, or more, from young people were about, how do you relate to your gay friend? Because so many more people are identifying as gay or LGBT or confused about their gender or something. And I spoke to the head of the camp, and she said, every year we get more and more questions about this. This is such an important question. There's a statistic now that something like 12% of millennials say that they're confused about their gender, or that they're transgender, or they have an alternate gender. The accurate number about how many people actually are confused about their gender in the United States is about 0.21%, but for millennials, it's, over an order of magnitude, well over an order of magnitude higher. And it's because of ideology. It's not because of this psychological condition of being confused about whether you're male or you're female. And it's not even about sexual preference. You're a man who's attracted sexually to men or women to women. It's because of ideology. It's because we're now told that the only sexual morality that we can consider is, if it feels good, do it. You hear the phrase sex positive. You've got to be sex positive, as though this means you have to go out and sleep with anybody you see and follow any urge of your passions or lusts or desires. I say this especially as a Catholic. Very few people are more sex positive than Catholics. They have like 10 kids on average. Who in the history of the world has not been sex positive? Everybody likes sex. But to be sex positive doesn't necessarily mean you have to be lust positive. Doesn't necessarily mean you have to embrace the hookup culture or pornography or various new sexual moralities. And look, I was an atheist for 10 years. I'm a product of my generation. I was totally convinced of that popular culture of sexual morality. If you feel good, do it. But then ultimately, I think you wake up one day and you get sort of sex-austed, culturally or personally, and you say, gosh, this doesn't make a whole lot of sense. This isn't terribly fulfilling. We even see this politically on the question of gay marriage, because the way that the debate had been framed by the activists was that gay people who are attracted to the same sex, need to have the right to get married. So it became an issue of civil rights. And, everyone has gay friends and they want them to have all the same rights that everybody else has. But that's not actually the question of gay marriage. The question of the people who defend marriage is, what is marriage? The people who are activists, they have the equal sign, they say, love is love. But that isn't quite true. There are all sorts of different kinds of love. I have love for my siblings. I have love for my family. I have love for my community. I have love for my country. I have love for my wife. I have love for my buddy. All these different kinds of love. And we don't call all of those kinds of love marriage. And for the entire history of the world, everywhere on earth in every civilization, marriage has always involved the union of husbands and wives. The sexual difference, the difference between men and women, has been essential to the definition of marriage forever. Obviously, we see this in Genesis, in the first chapters of Genesis. Sexual difference is so important to our human condition that we see this from the very first moments of the Bible. But we see this in other origin stories. We see this in myths. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, another very early origin story, sex and sexual difference are at the beginning of it. You see this in a lot of the pagan myths. That tells us something. I think there's a reason for that. And I think it's a very arrogant and prideful culture that thinks that everybody throughout the whole history of the world everywhere got something so completely wrong, and they were so bigoted and hateful and mean. And only we here in the United States 3 years ago figured out the real answer. Now we're told, if you hold the view of marriage that Barack Obama held not 7 years ago, if you hold that view, you're a bigot, you're awful, you're a hater, but you're not. You're just thinking about what it means to be human, what sex is, what is the purpose of our bodies, and what is marriage. But in a shallow culture, in a culture where we are being told, we are being indoctrinated through public schools and through popular culture, that if you don't affirm any new faddish sexual morality, that you're a hater or a bigot. It's very difficult, and it's especially difficult for young teenagers who are being told this by everybody, including their own teachers.
I had some friends that went to a Christian school through middle school, high school. They were able to pray for their friends when they went to the nurse's office. Like, that was just a small little thing, right? But that shapes the culture of your experience in school. The separation of church and state, which is a line that there's just people love throwing that line around, is one that I've heard from students of why they can't start a Bible club in their school, or even other youth workers. The reason why we can't be involved in the school, separation of church and state. Speaking from a place of experience, can you put that line into context? Because I think it's misused often.
Of course. Well, if there's a firm separation of church and state, if we're not ever allowed to talk about God, then I guess we have to throw out the Declaration of Independence, don't we?
Yeah,
because
and the Pledge of Allegiance, we got to get rid of that too.
They want to get rid of that, but at least they give lip service to the Declaration of Independence, which says we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights. Well, if we're endowed by our Creator, then we have a Creator, and the Creator has a capital C. We're talking about God. So obviously, something has changed in how we're using this phrase. You know, John Adams, our second president, said that this country was built for a moral and religious people, and it will not work for anyone else. You can't have a country that's irreligious and immoral and still have political freedom. Either you are going to discipline yourself, you're going to order yourself and restrain your passions, or that's going to be imposed from the top down and you're going to lose a lot of your political liberty. There were religious disagreements among the founding fathers. Some of them were less orthodox, you would say. Thomas Jefferson, one of them, he wrote the Declaration. He called himself a Christian, but then he also denied the miracles of Christ. Then he also had kind of interesting religious views that were less orthodox. But plenty of the founding fathers were very orthodox. They opened up the Constitutional Convention with prayer. Is that no longer allowed? We had prayer in the United States until the 1960s. Are we to say that that was somehow un-American, that was unconstitutional, that was wrong? Until then, no, nobody would believe that. This country was founded long before 1776 by religious Christian zealots called the Pilgrims, who came over here and landed at Plymouth on the Mayflower. And they were here the people who came later, all of the Puritans of New England, wanted to build a shining city on a hill. One of the most famous speeches in American history is called A Model of Christian Charity. Obviously, the country is Christian in its founding, and it is Christian then in its culture, and it's Christian in its politics and its political institutions. Our system of liberty, our Constitution, our republic, makes no sense outside of the context of Christianity. I think the people who today want a firm separation of church and state, who want to say that religion has no place in public life, I think what they want is all the wonderful fruits of Christian civilization, but they don't want the Christianity itself. They want all the fruits of our ancestors, but then they want to spit on our ancestors. They're standing on the shoulders of giants, and they think that they're flying.
When I look at culture today, if I was a kid, which I'm not, very old, but if I was a kid, I'd be looking and I'd be completely weirded out. And for me as a kid, that's a very common emotion. You just look at something and you're like, this is weird, this is odd. You know, a kid on TV who's getting destroyed for standing with his friends in Washington, D.C., wearing the wrong hat, apparently.
Right.
And then he's made the bad guy nationally. I mean, they're destroying this guy. If I was a high school kid or junior high kid, I'd look at that and be like, I don't want that to happen to me. I think that's having an impact on youth culture, and it's going to send ripples for a number of years. But speak to right now. What kind of impact do you think that's having right now?
Of course, it's having such a chilling effect. Obviously, social media existed when I was a late teenager. I was an older teenager. But a lot of kids today have Facebook from the time they're 9 or 10 years old. I can't even imagine if that were the case. Good grief, what would have been on there? And so there's a double-edged sword. On the one hand, the first part of the problem is that you see that the kid from Covington Catholic High School, he wears a MAGA hat. He was doing nothing. He was actually being harassed by this Native American activist and by these black supremacists. He was just standing there. He was barely smiling, and they said that he was the face of bigotry and evil. They smeared this kid to no end. That has a chilling effect. If you're watching that, and maybe you're a more conservative teenager, maybe you're a more Christian teenager, you're going to say, gosh, I better keep my mouth shut or I'm going to have my life ruined. That's on the one hand. Then on the other response that people could have to that is to say, this is so wrong, this is so unjust, I'm going to get so radical, I'm going to be so in your face that I'm going to say things that maybe I'll regret, and they're all going to be on social media, and they're all going to come back and haunt me in 10 years or 15 years. It is almost an impossible line, and I think the only way that you can possibly navigate that is the virtues, is to remind yourself of the virtues. Obviously the theological virtues, faith, hope, and charity. But you also have to take into account a lot of other virtues. Prudence. You need to be wise about what we're called to be, wise as a serpent and innocent as a dove. You need fortitude. Fortitude is a virtue. Now we're told that fortitude is a vice, and they call it toxic masculinity. But fortitude, strength, really is a virtue. And chief of all, the queen of all sins is pride. Of course, now we celebrate a whole Pride Month. Tells you a lot about our culture. But the opposite of pride, the primary virtue of those virtues is humility. And I think you need to have an important humility. If you can have humility and fortitude, if you can somehow cultivate both of those, make a habit out of both of those, I think it's going to put you in the best shape to survive a very challenging culture.
You know, I when I was a kid, we used to watch the State of the Union, different speeches in social studies class. Mm-hmm. That doesn't happen today. It's like a parade going down the street, and it's coming right down the middle of the street, and you got to be on one side or the other side. And like, no, I'm just hanging out in the middle of the street. No, there's no middle of the road. Either you're on the left or you're on the right. There's no middle ground. I think that is a big problem for students who aren't being exposed to not only everything that's out there, but how our government works and hearing ideas that you might disagree with. I think that's having a real practical effect. Speak to that side of it. What kind of effect do you see there?
Sure. Right now, if you stand in the middle of the road, you're going to get hit by a truck. So they want you to pick a side. I would always be skeptical of the ideologue, the one who just tells you this is the only way to see things, there's no other argument, and the people who have other arguments are just wicked, evil, awful people. Because they probably don't understand the other side. You'll notice that conservatives, when we talk about left-wingers, we usually just kind of make jokes about them. We say, oh yeah, not the brightest bulb in the pack, they're kind of not seeing something. But when left-wingers talk about right-wingers, it's either one of two answers. They're either evil or stupid. And the reason for this is because the ideology of the left is called progressivism. So you're progressing toward a utopia. There's a goal in mind, it's perfection. You're going to perfect the human spirit, human nature, and you're going to do it through politics and government. So if you stand in the way of progress, which is, I guess by definition, what conservatives do, you can either be one of two things. Really, really stupid. You'll remember they portrayed George W. Bush as really stupid. Maybe not evil, but stupid. Or you can be evil. And what did they do? They portrayed his vice president, Dick Cheney, as really, really evil. He wasn't stupid, but he was evil. And then with Donald Trump, it depends on the day of the week. One day he's a complete idiot. The other day he's an evil dictator, and it goes back and forth. That's how they look at it. And I've always been privileged because I've lived in very left-wing places. I lived in New York, very left-wing, very atheist. Went to a left-wing atheist college. Live in LA, we call it Gomorrah by the Sea. And as a result of living in those places, I constantly have had to defend my views. So if you have the audacity to be a conservative in those places, everyone is constantly assailing your views. And so when you have to defend them, you really sharpen what you think. You figure out what they think. You know what they think. That's just in the culture. And then you think about their arguments. You reject some of them. Maybe some of their arguments change your mind a little bit. Maybe you change some of your own views. But at the end of that, you are going to come out much stronger. I mean, this is the argument for exposing kids to different political points of view. And I think because the left can't stand up to scrutiny, because leftism actually can't win in a battle of ideas with conservative thought, I think what they try to do is censor conservatives in schools, at universities, on social media, in big technology, in the media, everywhere, because they know that if that debate were allowed to be had, the conservatives would win.
You know, there's an article that has been circulating the internet the last couple days, probably the last couple weeks, from Teen Vogue that talks about sex work is real work. I don't even know where to get started with that being one of the most insane things I've ever read, period, especially from a teen magazine telling young girls that, no, this is the narrative of your life. This is, you could aspire to this.
Yeah.
10 years ago, that never would have been printed. At least I think it wouldn't have been. Maybe it would have been. I don't know. I don't think it would have been printed 10 years ago. Today, that's just normal, everyday. That's totally okay. Why is that you've seen at least? And where do we even begin to combat that kind of ideology?
So they're going after kids increasingly because kids are ignorant. Kids aren't stupid. Kids are just as smart as you and me. They're just as intelligent as any adult. But they're ignorant. They haven't had their education, or they haven't had most of their education. So they go after kids because kids don't know better. Teen Vogue has become the most radical magazine in the entire world, not coincidentally. They also ran a piece on the legacy of Karl Marx. Now I could tell you the legacy of Karl Marx in one sentence, and it's 100 million people dead. Pure human misery, but they don't talk about that there. And they constantly are talking about sex. Now, there's something to it. There's a grain of truth. I suppose sex work is real work in the sense that sex work is a made-up euphemism. What they're talking about is prostitution. And if you're a prostitute, you are working. I mean, you're making money and you're doing a job. But it's misery. You are degrading yourself. You are selling yourself as though you are not a human being with a soul, with rationality, with consciousness, as though you're just a piece of meat, as though you're just a piece of flesh. It is so awful. It is so degrading. And nobody is a prostitute by choice. They might have ultimately made some decision that led them to become a prostitute, but they are prostitutes by circumstance. It is miserable. It is awful. It is exploitative, and it is wrong. So what the left wants to do is convince you that you don't have a soul, you don't have a rational mind, you don't even have free will. You're just a piece of meat. We're all just stuff. The only stuff that exists is just matter. And so, of course, then, your body ceases to be dignified as a human. It's just a piece of meat. And so if you're just a piece of meat, then I guess sex work is no different than any other kind of work. This is an ideology called materialism. Now, the other reason why the left talks about sex all the time, it used to be a pride parade for gay pride. Now it's a pride month. And now, even just since I was a kid, movies and television have become much more graphic, much more sexual, much more pornographic. And Teen Vogue is talking about sex all the time. The reason they do it is because sex sells. They know that sex is very titillating. As I said, it's at the very beginning of Genesis. Sex is essential to who we are. And lust is a vice. Lust is a temptation. And so, especially for kids who are at that very tender age, 12, 13, 14, sex is all you think about. When I was a teenager, I thought about sex at least 30% of the time. I don't know, probably more than that. And so if you get into their minds via sex, talking about sex workers or whatever, and then you use that entrance to indoctrinate in a much more pernicious, really, ideology of materialism, of nihilism, of the world doesn't mean anything, of atheism. It's a very effective way to do it, and once it's lodged in there, it's very hard to unlodge as the education institutions encourage those beliefs.
As we're wrapping up this part, I want to talk about young men specifically, young boys, not only just the young boys that are walking through the grocery checkout with their parents, seeing the Teen Vogue sex work, and that's how maybe we should view women. I think that's a completely toxic thing to be teaching young boys. But even looking further, the abortion argument, which is completely insane, the murder of children, completely insane, that it's a women's right, completely eliminating the responsibility of men, really saying, you're just really a donor, you have no role in this, until they're born, then you got to pay money and be part of their life, but up until the moment they're born, you really have no role. It's something that we're teaching young people, that they don't really have to have responsibility. They don't really have to have a role in the preparation. I have 2 kids. I was putting the stroller together. I was buying stuff. I was preparing for the preparation of that stage of my life. What do you think the impact is, and where do you see it in all these different ways that we're degrading the responsibility that young men should be having in preparation for being, the leaders of households, the leaders of young kids? What do you see?
Well, I think it comes out of the much bigger ideology of liberalism. It comes out of the ideology that only seeks to maximize your individual liberty. And the right, frankly, is almost as guilty of this as the left is. It comes out of this ideology that says, you are just you. You have no connection to your family. You have no connection to the girl you're sleeping with. You have no connection to your country. Life is all about you, numero uno. And so we're told that, if a guy sleeps with a girl and she gets pregnant, it's not his problem. She can go take care of it. It's her choice. We're told that if the girl gets pregnant, and she has a baby inside of her with unique DNA, with unique body parts, a beating heart, that's not really another person. It's just if it's not convenient for you, you can just kill that baby. It's no big deal. And some people who are proponents of this ideology have been honest about it. There was a feminist in the 1990s named Naomi Wolf who admitted that the baby is a baby. You can use whatever made-up word you want, fetus Fetus, by the way, is just a Latin word that means offspring. It just means baby. You can use the word zygote or blastula or whatever, embryo. And it all means the same thing. It's all referring to the same person. And what she said is, we have to admit, we feminists, that the fetus is a baby. And in order to achieve true equality, or you might say true individual liberty, we must be able to kill the baby in all of its humanity. That's a wicked philosophy, but that's the natural end of that philosophy. And the answer to that philosophy is, my individual maximizing autonomy is not the be-all and end-all of the world. Christ did not come into the world to enjoy his individual liberty and live a very posh, enjoyable existence. He came into this world to serve. He came into this world to die for his friends. We have obligations to one another and to God. And so when you live just for yourself, I mean, this is the biggest trick of all. We're told that if you live for yourself, you're going to have a great time. People who live for themselves are completely miserable. And we're told if you live for other people, you're going to be put upon, you're going to have an awful life. Not true. The people who live for others, who give of themselves selflessly, who have bonds of love between them and the girl they're sleeping with, between them and their wives, between them and their family and their town and their country. Those are the people with the fullest life. That's truly what it means to be human.
Well, I was at the Bill Maher show. I was a friend of mine, Matt Lewis from CNN, was a guest on the show. And I got to hang out with Tim Ryan a little bit, met him. Super normal guy. Okay, so we had a drink. Super normal guy, and loosened his tie. It was a great conversation. But then I see him in interviews and even in the debate, and I know you had some positive things to say about him from the debate. That it's like, where was the guy I was having a scotch with? Like, and you've worked on presidential campaigns. Why is it that they seem so chill and relaxed when you're just having a normal conversation, but then they start with the talking points and they sound insane?
Right. I was watching that debate. Tim Ryan, I felt, was the only guy on that stage who wasn't just a total psychopath. He didn't win the debate. He performed very poorly and he was nervous and he didn't do well. And I disagreed with most of what he was saying. But there was something about him that seemed almost kind of normal. What happens so often, I mean, I've worked on presidential campaigns and a lot of other campaigns too, is people get scared. They're running as if they've got something to lose. They're running not to lose. They're thinking, if I say this, how is this going to play in this area? If I do it this way, if I look this way, if I'm nice to this guy, and they're just so calculating. They're running before they've got something to do. Whereas somebody like President Trump is basically fearless. A lot of people criticized him. They said he's not even seriously running for president. It's just a gimmick. Maybe that was the case, but it gave him a sort of fearlessness where he said, I don't care. If you want to elect me. I think I'll be a good president. But I'm not going to pretend to be somebody that I'm not. This is exactly who I am. This is exactly what I want to do. And so all of the other candidates in 2016, they were trying to figure out exactly the right policy within this scope from these think tanks. And then you get to somebody like Trump. Trump genuinely offered a different set of policy proposals from almost all of the other candidates. And it's because he doesn't come from that world of DC. He doesn't come from those think tanks and the Capitol Hill and all of that. And he said, well, this is what I believe. Take it or leave it. I don't care. If I don't get elected president, I'll go make another $1 billion somewhere else. That gives you a lot of freedom. And it's the kind of classic problem. You don't want a guy to be president who really, really wants to be president. And by definition, everyone who becomes president wants it. But if you've got something else going on in your life, if you're not reliant on winning elective office for another paycheck or something, it gives you a lot more freedom and it allows you to be much more authentic.
I get the fear thing. If I was a Democrat, I'd be totally afraid of the Twitter mob, of just being destroyed, that you have to say the most progressive out there things to even be heard. Mm-hmm. Do you think that it's going to keep going that direction? Is there going to, because I know nothing about, I'm not a political guy. I don't do commentary. I'm a youth pastor, but I look at it and I say, you know what? If I took control of a campaign, I think I could get the guy to win. We're going to be nice and normal, and we're going to appeal to all the normal people out there who are not insane. And yeah, we'll get destroyed on Twitter, but the majority of people are going to listen and be like, okay, they don't hate me and they're not calling me names. And I think that person would win. So you're the political expert. Is there any real logic to that? Am I crazy in my thinking? What do you think?
Do you want me to be honest?
I do.
You're crazy. You're absolutely crazy. And especially in today's Democratic Party, because, I mean, we saw what happened with Howard Schultz. Howard Schultz, the CEO of Starbucks, a genuine Democrat, and a guy with an amazing life story. He grew up in public housing in the projects of Canarsie, became the CEO of one of the most important and biggest companies in the world. He's running as a Democrat, and he said, look, we're not socialists, but I'm a pretty sharp guy. I love my country. I know how to make it out of poverty. I know how to live a pretty good life, and I'm going to bring that to all of you. And he got absolutely clobbered. He's not polling at all. I mean, he's not even really running anymore. He's suspended his campaign. Nobody wants that. You have a Democratic Party now where the heads of the party have said that if you don't think we should be able to kill children at any time, you're not welcome in the party. If you don't think that we should gut the Second Amendment and ignore it, you don't have any rights in the party. And increasingly, we're being told, if you're not a socialist, if you don't embrace a wicked, evil ideology that led to untold misery in the 20th century, that you're not welcome in the party. So the people who are left, especially in the Democrat primary electorate, are so radical that even if you might have a chance to win the general election, you would certainly lose the primary. The other issue is that politics is more polarized now, and everyone complains about that. I actually don't think it's the worst thing in the world. The old complaint in about 100 years ago or 70 years ago was that the parties were exactly the same. You couldn't tell what the difference was. And so you had Barry Goldwater and some of the early conservative candidates say, we want to give you a choice, not an echo. We want to genuinely give you a different choice, not just this sort of liberal consensus, but different points of view. And now the points of view are much clearer. And the polarization has not happened equally. So the right has moved more to the right, the left has moved more to the left, but the left has moved more to the left than the right has moved to the right. Donald Trump is not the most conservative guy. He was a Democrat for most of his life. He donated to Pelosi and Hillary Clinton. He's held very moderate and left-wing views and very unorthodox views. And the GOP embraced him, and then obviously the country embraced him. The left only has one ideology, whereas the right has the religious right, the neoconservatives, traditionalists, the libertarians, all these different ideas. The left only has progressivism, and progressivism is going to progress. It's going to move over there further and further, faster and faster. And so now, especially at a time when there really aren't any problems in the country to talk about, the only thing that the left can do is offer to buy votes, to give away more and more money. And you saw this the other night. They're basically willing to give everything away for free. $1.6 trillion in student loans, take over all of the healthcare system, give healthcare to every illegal alien in the country. That's the end of that. And I don't see any limiting principle that is going to bring some sanity back to that party.
Well, let's do a quick lightning round as we're wrapping up. Give me a couple books that you think everyone should read, either stuff you're reading now or stuff you've read before.
I mentioned earlier Mere Christianity by C.S. Lewis. It's a fabulous book. It's a book that a 3-year-old can read, and it's profound for an 83-year-old to get something out of it. It's just a fabulous distillation of some Christian thought. So I love that. I'm reading The Conservative Mind now by Russell Kirk. That's a great book. It's a little bit of a slower read, but I always recommend it. And if you want some good Christian history, I always loved Hilaire Belloc. He's great. And then if you want kind of more broadly a good overview of the history of modernity, of Western civilization, one of the all-time great books for this is called From Dawn to Decadence by Jacques Barzun. And that book is, he wrote it when he was about 100 years old, so he'd lived through a fifth of it. And it gives you a fabulous history of Western civilization. And then The Secret Book, one of my all-time favorite books, it was written by a pal of C.S. Lewis and the Inklings and J.R.R. Tolkien, is a book called Poetic Diction by Owen Barfield. And that's another slow and difficult read, but I highly recommend at some point getting to that book. It's a mind-altering, if not life-changing book.
I love that. What podcasts are you listening to? What's some stuff our listeners should check out?
So I listen to a lot of sort of eclectic range of podcasts. I listen to one radio show on podcast, which is the Patrick Madrid Show. He's a Catholic guy, and it's a call-in show, and it's just questions about Christianity and life in the faith. And he's a fabulous exegete, and he's really accessible and super sharp guy. So I really like his. I like Victor Davis Hanson's podcast, The Classicist. That's a really good show at the Hoover Institution. I like Uncommon Knowledge. Believe it or not, I like Bill Kristol's podcast, which is called Conversations. He's a former conservative who's now seems very left-wing, but it's still a pretty good show. And then I have to recommend, more than anything, put down whatever you're listening to. You've got to listen to the Michael Knowles Show, the Ben Shapiro Show, the Andrew Klavan Show, and the Matt Walsh Show, which is what we put out here at the Daily Wire.
Of course, of course. I agree with all of that. Michael, thank you so much for spending time with us.
It's such a pleasure. Thanks for having me. I really enjoyed it.